In 1971, the United States did something no empire in history had ever attempted. It convinced the world to accept its debt as wealth, not temporarily, not as a trick, as the foundation of the entire global financial system. And somehow, 50 years later, it's still working. The US national debt is now $36 trillion. That number is so large, it stops meaning anything. But here's what should bother you. The country that owes more money than any nation in history also happens to control the currency everyone uses to settle that debt. It's like owing your friend $1 million, but you're also the one printing the cash to pay him back, and he has to accept it. This is not a story about economics. It's a story about power, and how one country turned what should have been a disaster into the most sophisticated financial weapon ever created. Let's go back. August 15th, 1971, a Sunday night. President Richard Nixon appears on television and announces that the United States will no longer convert dollars into gold. He calls it temporary. He says it's about protecting American jobs. But what he's really saying is this: the rules just changed, and we're the ones changing them. Up until that moment, the global economy ran on something called the Bretton Woods system. It was simple. Every major currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. $35 bought you 1 ounce. It gave everyone confidence. The dollar wasn't just paper, it was a promise backed by something real. But there was a problem. The US was spending money it didn't have. The Vietnam War, social programs, Cold War arms races. By 1971, there were more dollars circulating the world than there was gold sitting in Fort Knox. Other countries started to notice. France, under Charles de Gaulle, actually sent warships to New York Harbor to collect gold in exchange for dollars. They didn't trust the system anymore. So Nixon had 2 choices: raise taxes, cut spending, and admit the empire couldn't afford its ambitions, or tear up the rule book entirely. He chose door number 2. Now, if you or I did this, we'd be called deadbeats. If a company did it, the stock would collapse. But when the United States did it, something strange happened. Nothing. Well, not nothing. There was inflation, there was uncertainty, but the dollar didn't disappear. It didn't become worthless. Instead, it became more powerful. Here's why. When Nixon severed the link to gold, he didn't destroy confidence in the dollar. He just moved it. The new backing wasn't gold, it was something better. It was need. See, by the 1970s, oil had become the blood of the global economy. Every country needed it. And after a series of quiet deals with Saudi Arabia and OPEC, oil could only be bought in one currency: dollars. It didn't matter if you were Germany or Japan or Brazil. If you wanted oil, you needed dollars. And to get dollars, you had to sell the United States something it wanted, or borrow them, or hold them in reserve. This created a feedback loop. The more the world needed oil, the more it needed dollars. The more it needed dollars, the more it had to trust the US financial system. Suddenly, American debt wasn't a burden, it was an export. Let's make this concrete. When the US government spends more than it collects in taxes, it borrows the difference by issuing treasury bonds. These are IOUs, promises to pay you back with interest. Now, normally, if a country keeps borrowing, investors get nervous. They demand higher interest rates. They worry about default. But US treasuries are different. They're considered the safest asset on the planet, safer than gold, safer than property. When the world panics, when markets crash, when wars break out, everyone runs to US debt. Why? Because it's not just debt, it's the foundation of global liquidity. Central banks hold it as reserves. Pension funds park money in it. International trade gets settled with it. The entire architecture of global finance assumes that US treasuries will always be there, always stable, always liquid. So the US can borrow at rates lower than countries with balanced budgets. It can run deficits that would destroy other economies. It can print money during crises without triggering hyperinflation, not because of good policy, because the system needs it to. This is called exorbitant privilege, and it's the reason the US can have a military budget larger than the next 10 countries combined, fight wars on multiple continents, bail out banks, send stimulus checks, and still borrow more money at cheaper rates than almost anyone else. Debt isn't a weakness, it's the product. But here's where it gets strange. The more the US borrows, the more the world depends on that borrowing continuing. Think about it. If the US suddenly balanced its budget, stopped running deficits, stopped issuing new treasury bonds, what would happen? Global liquidity would dry up. There'd be fewer safe assets for central banks to hold, fewer dollars circulating in international trade. The system doesn't just tolerate US debt, it requires it. It's a trap, but everyone's inside it together. China holds over $800 billion in US treasuries. Japan holds over $1 trillion. They're funding the very country they're supposedly competing against. Why? Because they have to. Their economies depend on exporting goods to the US. To do that, they need Americans to keep spending. And Americans keep spending because debt is cheap and the dollar is strong. It's a circular machine, and the US is the only one with their hand on the lever. Now, you might be thinking this can't last forever, and you'd be right to think that, but there are cracks. In 2023, the US spent over $600 billion just paying interest on the debt, not the debt itself, just the interest. That's more than the entire defense budget in some years, more than education, more than infrastructure. And that was when rates were relatively low. If rates keep climbing, the interest alone could become the largest line item in the federal budget. Then there's the political side, the debt ceiling fights, the government shutdowns, the fact that every few years the US flirts with default, not because it can't pay, but because Congress can't agree whether it should. In 2011, the US lost its A+++ credit rating for the first time in history, not because of economics, because of dysfunction. Other countries are watching. China has been quietly trying to internationalize the yuan. Russia has been dumping treasuries. The BRICS nations have been discussing alternatives to the dollar for trade settlement. None of it has worked yet, but the desire is there. Because here's the thing about exorbitant privilege. It only works as long as everyone believes in it. So why hasn't it collapsed? Because there's no alternative. The euro? Fragmented across countries that don't always agree. The yuan? Controlled by a government that restricts capital flows. Gold? Can't scale to a $100 trillion global economy. The dollar remains the default because everything else is worse. And the US knows this. It's why sanctions work. When the US cuts a country off from the dollar system, they cut them off from the world. Russia found this out in 2022. Iran has been living it for years. Control the currency, control the leverage. This is why the debt isn't just an economic phenomenon, it's geopolitical infrastructure. Every treasury bond sold is a thread in a web that ties the world to US interests, not through force, but necessity. But let's play this out. What happens if confidence breaks? Not all at once, slow, a steady drift, countries diversifying reserves, trade settling in other currencies, investors demanding higher yields to compensate for risk. The privilege starts to fade, interest payments spiral. The US has to cut spending or raise taxes or print money. Inflation kicks in, the dollar weakens. And because the entire global system is priced in dollars, everything wobbles. It wouldn't just hurt the US, it would destabilize everyone, which is exactly why it probably won't happen overnight. But slow burns are still burns. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States turned debt into power by making the world complicit in its survival. It's not that the U.S. tricked everyone. It's that the system evolved into something where American borrowing became global stability. And now we're all locked in. $36 trillion and counting. Not because Washington is reckless, not because politicians are stupid, because the math works. As long as the world keeps playing. The real question isn't whether the U.S. will pay back its debt. It's what happens the day the world stops asking it to.